Steady-state economy. A steady-state economy is an economy made up of a constant stock of physical wealth capital and a constant population size. In effect, such an economy does not grow in the course of time. The term usually refers to the national economy of a particular country, but it is also applicable to the economic system of a city, a region, or the entire world. Early in the history of economic thought, classical economist Adam Smith of the 18th century developed the concept of a stationary state of an economy. Smith believed that any national economy in the world would sooner or later settle in a final state of stationarity. Since the 1970s, the concept of a steady-state economy has been associated mainly with the work of leading ecological economist Herman Daly. As Daly's concept of a steady state includes the ecological analysis of natural resource flows through the economy, his concept differs from the original classical concept of a stationary state. One other difference is that Daly recommends immediate political action to establish the steady-state economy by imposing permanent government restrictions on all resource use, whereas economists of the classical period believed that the final stationary state of any economy would evolve by itself without any government intervention. The world's mounting ecological problems have brought about a widening interest in the concept of a steady-state economy. Critics of the steady-state economy usually object to it by arguing that resource decoupling, technological development, and the unrestrained operation of market mechanisms are capable of overcoming any resource scarcity, any rampant pollution, or population overshoot. Proponents of the steady-state economy, on the other hand, maintain that these objections remain insubstantial and mistaken, and that the need for a steady-state economy is becoming more compelling every day. A steady-state economy is not to be confused with economic stagnation. Whereas a steady-state economy is established as the result of deliberate political action, economic stagnation is the unexpected and unwelcome failure of a growth economy. An ideological contrast to the steady-state economy is formed by the concept of a post-scarcity economy. Definition and vision. Since the 1970s, the concept of a steady-state economy has been associated mainly with the work of leading ecological economist Herman Daly. Herman Daly defines his concept of a steady-state economy as an economic system made up of a constant stock of physical wealth capital and a constant stock of people population, both stocks to be maintained by a flow of natural resources through the system. The first component, the constant stocks, is similar to the concept of the stationary state originally used in classical economics. The second component, the flow of natural resources, is a new ecological feature, presently also used in the academic discipline of ecological economics. The durability of both of the constant stocks is to be maximized. The more durable the stock of capital is, the smaller the flow of natural resources is needed to maintain the stock. Likewise, a durable population means a population enjoying a high life expectancy, something desirable by itself maintained by a low birth rate and an equally low death rate. Taken together, higher durability translates into better ecology in the system as a whole. Daly's concept of a steady-state economy is based on the vision that man's economy is an open subsystem embedded in a finite natural environment of scarce resources and fragile ecosystems. The economy is maintained by importing valuable natural resources from the input end and exporting valueless waste and pollution at the output end in a constant and irreversible flow. Any subsystem of a finite non-growing system must itself at some point also become non-growing and start maintaining itself in a steady state as far as possible. This vision is opposed to mainstream neoclassical economics, where the economy is represented by an isolated and circular model with goods and services exchanging endlessly between companies and households without exhibiting any physical contact to the natural environment. In the early 2010s, reviewers sympathetic towards Daly's concept of a steady-state economy have passed the concurrent judgment that although his concept remains beyond what is politically feasible at present, there is room for mainstream thinking and collective action to approach the concept in the future. Historical background. Concept of the stationary state in classical economics. From Adam Smith and onwards, economists in the classical period of economic theorizing described the general development of society in terms of a contrast between the scarcity of arable agricultural land on the one hand and the growth of population and capital on the other hand. The incomes from gross production were distributed as rents, profits, and wages among landowners, capitalists, and laborers respectively, and these three classes were incessantly engaged in the struggle for increasing their own share. The accumulation of capital net investments would sooner or later come to an end as the rate of profit fell to a minimum or to nil. At that point, the economy would settle in a final stationary state with a constant population size and a constant stock of capital. Adam Smith's concept. David Ricardo's concept. In the early 19th century, David Ricardo was the leading economist of the day and the champion of British laissez-faire liberalism. He is known today for his free trade principle of comparative advantage and for his formulation of the controversial labor theory of value. Ricardo replaced Adam Smith's empirical reasoning with abstract principles and deductive argument. This new methodology would later become the norm in economics as a science. In Ricardo's times, Britain's trade with the European continent was somewhat disrupted during the Napoleonic Wars that had raged since 1803. The continental system brought into effect a large-scale embargo against British trade, whereby the nation's food supply came to rely heavily on domestic agriculture to the benefit of the landowning classes. When the wars ended with Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, the landowning classes dominating the British Parliament had managed to tighten the existing corn laws in order to retain their monopoly status on the home market during peacetime. The controversial corn laws were a protectionist, two-sided measure of subsidies on corn exports and tariffs on corn imports. The tightening was opposed by both the capitalist and the laboring classes, as the high price of bread effectively reduced real profits and real wages in the economy. So was the political setting when Ricardo published his treatise on the principles of political economy and taxation in 1817. According to Ricardo, the limits to growth were ever present due to scarcity of arable agricultural land in the country. In the wake of the wartime period, the British economy seemed to be approaching the stationary state as population was growing. Plots of land with lower fertility were put into agricultural use, and the rising rents of the rural landowning class were crowding out the profits of the urban capitalists. This was the broad outline of Ricardo's controversial land rent theory. Ricardo believed that the only way for Britain to avoid the stationary state was to increase her volume of international trade. The country should export more industrial products and start importing cheap agricultural products from abroad in turn. However, this course of development was impeded by the corn laws that seemed to be hampering both the industrialization and the internationalization of the British economy. In the 1820s, Ricardo and his followers, Ricardo himself died in 1823, directed much of their fire at the corn laws in order to have them repealed, and various other free trade campaigners borrowed indiscriminately from Ricardo's doctrines to suit their agenda. The corn laws were not repealed before 1846. In the meantime, the British economy kept growing, a fact that effectively undermined the credibility and thrust of Ricardian economics in Britain. But Ricardo had by now established himself as the first stationary state theorist in the history of economic thought. Ricardo's preoccupation with class conflict anticipated the work of Karl Marx. See below. John Stuart Mill's concept. John Stuart Mill was the leading economist, philosopher, and social reformer in mid-19th century Britain. His economics treatise on the principles of political economy, published in 1848, attained status as the standard textbook in economics throughout the English-speaking world until the turn of the century. A champion of classical liberalism, Mill believed that an ideal society should allow all individuals to pursue their own good without any interference from others or from government. Also a utilitarian philosopher, Mill regarded the greatest happiness principle as the ultimate ideal for a harmonious society. As the means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin, first, that laws and social arrangements should place the happiness of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole, and secondly, that education and opinion, which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power as to establish in the mind. Mill's concept of the stationary state was strongly colored by these ideals. Mill conjectured that the stationary state of society was not too far away in the future. It must always have been seen, more or less distinctly, by political economists that the increase of wealth is not boundless, that at the end of what they term the progressive state lies the stationary state, that all progress in wealth is but a postponement of this, and that each step in advance is an approach to it. We have now been led to recognize that this ultimate goal is at all times near enough to be fully in view, that we are always on the verge of it, and that, if we have not reached it long ago, it is because the goal itself flies before us. Contrary to both Smith and Ricardo before him, Mill took an optimistic view on the future stationary state. Mill could not regard the stationary state of capital and wealth with the unaffected aversion so generally manifested toward it by political economists of the old school. Instead, Mill attributed many important qualities to this future state. He even believed the state would bring about a very considerable improvement on our present condition. According to Mill, the stationary state was at one and the same time inevitable, necessary, and desirable. It was inevitable because the accumulation of capital would bring about a falling rate of profit that would diminish investment opportunities and hamper further accumulation. It was also necessary because mankind had to learn how to reduce its size and its level of consumption. Hence, Mill was able to express all of his liberal ideals for mankind through his concept of the stationary state. It has been argued that Mill essentially made a quality of life argument for the stationary state. Main developments in economics since Mill. John Maynard Keynes's concept of reaching saturation. John Maynard Keynes was the paradigm founder of modern macroeconomics and is widely considered today to be the most influential economist of the 20th century. Keynes rejected the basic tenet of classical economics that free markets would lead to full employment by themselves. Consequently, he recommended government intervention to stimulate aggregate demand in the economy, a macroeconomic policy now known as Keynesian. Keynes also believed that capital accumulation would reach saturation at some point in the future. In his essay from 1930 on the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, Keynes ventured to look 100 years ahead into the future and predict the standard of living in the 21st century. Writing at the beginning of the Great Depression, Keynes rejected the prevailing bad attack of economic pessimism of his own time and foresaw that by 2030, the grandchildren of his generation would live in a state of abundance where saturation would have been reached. People would find themselves liberated from such economic activities as saving and capital accumulation, and be able to get rid of pseudo-moral principles, avarice, exaction of interest, love of money that had characterized capitalistic societies so far. Instead, people would devote themselves to the true art of life, to live wisely and agreeably and well. Mankind would finally have solved the economic problem, that is, the struggle for existence. The similarity between John Stuart Mill's concept of the stationary state see above and Keynes's predictions in this essay has been noted. It has been argued that although Keynes was right about future growth rates, he underestimated the inequalities prevailing today, both within and across countries. He was also wrong in predicting that greater wealth would induce more leisure spent. In fact, the reverse trend seems to be true. In his magnum opus on the general theory of employment, interest and money, Keynes looked only one generation ahead into the future and predicted that state intervention balancing aggregate demand would by then have caused capital accumulation to reach the point of saturation. The marginal efficiency of capital as well as the rate of interest would both be brought down to zero, and if population was not increasing rapidly, society would finally attain the conditions of a quasi-stationary community where change and progress would result only from changes in technique, taste, population and institutions, and institutions, and institutions. Keynes believed this development would bring about the disappearance of the rentier class, something he welcomed. Keynes argued that rentiers incurred no sacrifice for their earnings, and their savings did not lead to productive investments unless aggregate demand in the economy was sufficiently high. I see, therefore, the rentier aspect of capitalism as a transitional phase which will disappear when it has done its work. Post-war economic expansion and emerging ecological concerns. The economic expansion following World War II took place while mainstream economics largely neglected the importance of natural resources and environmental constraints in the development. Addressing this discrepancy, ecological concerns emerged in academia around 1970. Later on, these concerns developed into the formation of ecological economics as an academic subdiscipline in economics. Post-war economic expansion and the neglect of mainstream economics. After the ravages of World War II, the industrialized part of the world experienced almost 3 decades of unprecedented and prolonged economic expansion. This expansion, known today as the post-World War II economic expansion, was brought about by international financial stability. During the era, all the advanced countries who founded or later joined the OECD enjoyed robust and sustained growth rates as well as full employment. In the 1970s, the expansion ended with the 1973 oil crisis, resulting in the 1973-75 recession and the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system. Throughout this era, mainstream economics dominated by both neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics developed theories and models where natural resources and environmental constraints were neglected. Conservation issues related specifically to agriculture and forestry were left to specialists in the subdiscipline of environmental economics at the margins of the mainstream. As the theoretical framework of neoclassical economics, namely general equilibrium theory, was uncritically adopted and maintained by even environmental economics, this subdiscipline was rendered largely unable to consider important issues of concern to environmental policy. In the years around 1970, the widening discrepancy between an ever-growing world economy on the one hand and a mainstream economics discipline not taking into account the importance of natural resources and environmental constraints on the other hand, was finally addressed indeed, challenged in academia by a few unorthodox economists and researchers. Emerging ecological concerns. During the short period of time from 1966 to 1972, 4 works were published addressing the importance of natural resources and the environment to human society. In his 1966 philosophical-minded essay on the economics of the coming spaceship Earth, economist and systems scientist Kenneth E. Boulding argued that mankind would soon have to adapt to economic principles much different than the past open Earth of illimitable plains and exploitative behavior. On the basis of the thermodynamic principle of the conservation of matter and energy, Boulding developed the view that the flow of natural resources through the economy is a rough measure of the gross national product (GNP), and, consequently, that society should start regarding the GNP as a cost to be minimized rather than a benefit to be maximized. Therefore, mankind would have to find its place in a cyclical ecological system without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution, like a spaceman on board a spaceship. Boulding was not the first to make use of the spaceship Earth metaphor, but he was the one who combined this metaphor with the analysis of natural resource flows through the economy. In his 1971 magnum opus on the entropy law and the economic process, Romanian-American economist Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen integrated the thermodynamic concept of entropy with economic analysis and argued that all natural resources are irreversibly degraded when put to use in economic activity. What happens in the economy is that all matter and energy is transformed from states available for human purposes, valuable natural resources, to states unavailable for human purposes, valueless waste and pollution. In the history of economic thought, Georgescu Rojan was also the first economist of some standing to theorize on the premise that all of Earth's mineral resources will eventually be exhausted at some point see below. Also in 1971, pioneering ecologist and general systems analyst Howard T. Odum published his book on environment, power, and society, where he described human society in terms of ecology. He formulated the maximum power principle, according to which all organisms, ecosystems, and human societies organize themselves in order to maximize their use of available energy for survival. Odum pointed out that those human societies with access to the higher quality of energy sources enjoyed an advantage over other societies. Odum later co-developed the concept of emergy, i.e., embodied energy, and made other valuable contributions to ecology and systems analysis. His work provided the biological term ecology with its broader societal meaning used today. In 1972, scientist and systems analyst Dennis Meadows and his team of researchers had their study on the limits to growth published by the Club of Rome. The Meadows team modeled aggregate trends in the world economy and made the projection, not prediction, that by the mid to latter part of the 21st century, industrial production per capita, food supply per capita, and world population would all reach a peak and then rapidly decline in a vicious overshoot and collapse trajectory. Due to its dire pessimism, the study was scorned and dismissed by most mainstream economists at the time of its publication. However, well into the 21st century, several independent researchers have confirmed that world economic trends so far do indeed match up to the original standard-run projections made by the Meadows team, indicating that a global collapse may still loom large in the not-too-distant future. Taken together, these four works were seminal in bringing about the formation of ecological economics later on. Formation of ecological economics as an academic subdiscipline. Although most of the theoretical and foundational work behind ecological economics was in place by the early 1970s, a long gestation period elapsed before this new academic subdiscipline in economics was properly named and institutionalized. Ecological economics was formally founded in 1988 as the culmination of a series of conferences and meetings through the 1980s, where key scholars interested in the ecology-economy interdependency were interacting with each other. The most important people involved in the establishment were Herman Daly and Robert Costanza from the US, and Mary Jansen from Sweden, and Juan Martínez Alier from Spain, Catalonia. Since 1989, the discipline has been organized in the International Society for Ecological Economics that publishes the Journal of Ecological Economics. When the ecological economics subdiscipline was established, Herman Daly's preanalytic vision of the economy was widely shared among the members who joined in. The human economy is an open subsystem of a finite and non-growing ecosystem, Earth's natural environment, and any subsystem of a fixed non-growing system must itself at some point also become non-growing. Indeed, it has been argued that the subdiscipline itself was born out of frustration with the unwillingness of the established disciplines to accept this vision. However, ecological economics has since been overwhelmed by the influence and domination of neoclassical economics and its everlasting free market orthodoxy. This development has been deplored by activistic ecological economists as an incoherent, shallow, and overly pragmatic slide. Herman Daly's concept of a steady-state economy. Ecological reasons for a steady-state economy. In 2021 study checked if the current situation confirms the predictions of the book Limits to Growth. The conclusion was that in 10 years the global GDP will begin to decline. If it will not happen by deliberate transition, it will happen by ecological disaster. Planetary boundaries. The world's mounting ecological problems have stimulated interest in the concept of a steady-state economy. Since the 1990s, most metrics have provided evidence that the volume of the world economy far exceeds critical global limits to economic growth already. According to the ecological footprint measure, Earth's carrying capacity, that is, Earth's long-term capacity to sustain human populations and consumption levels was exceeded by some 30% in 1995. By 2018, this figure had increased to some 70%. In 2020, multinational team of scientists published a study saying that overconsumption is the biggest threat to sustainability. According to the study, a drastic change in lifestyle is necessary for solving the ecological crisis. According to one of the authors, Julia Steinberger, to protect ourselves from the worsening climate crisis, we must reduce inequality and challenge the notion that riches, and those who possess them, are inherently good. The research was published on the site of the World Economic Forum. The leader of the forum, Professor Klaus Schwab, calls to a great reset of capitalism. In effect, mankind is confronted by an ecological crisis in which humans are living outside of planetary boundaries, which will have significant effects on human health and well-being. The significant impact of human activities on Earth's ecosystems has motivated some geologists to propose the present epoch be named the Anthropocene. The following issues have raised much concern worldwide: pollution and global warming. Air pollution emanating from motor vehicles and industrial plants is damaging public health and increasing mortality rates. The concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is the apparent source of global warming and climate changes. Extreme regional weather patterns and rising sea levels caused by warming degrade living conditions in many, if not all, parts of the world. The warming already poses a security threat to many nations and works as a so-called threat multiplier to geopolitical stability. Even worse, the loss of Arctic permafrost may be triggering a massive release of methane and other greenhouse gases from thawing soils in the region, thereby overwhelming political action to counter climate change. If critical temperature thresholds are crossed, Earth's climate may transit from an icehouse to a greenhouse state for the first time in 34 million years. One of the most common solutions to the climate crisis is transitioning to renewable energy, but it also has some environmental impacts. They are presented by the proponents of theories like degrowth, steady-state economy, and circular economy as one of the proofs that for achieving sustainability technological methods are not enough and there is a need to limit kinds. On, van, pan, on, and so, According to the report, in 2019, plastic will contribute greenhouse gases in the equivalent of 850 million tons of carbon dioxide CO2 to the atmosphere. In current trend, annual emissions will grow to 1.34 billion tons by 2030. By 2050, plastic could emit 56 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, as much as 14% of the Earth's remaining carbon budget, except the harm to phytoplankton. The report says that only solutions which involve a reduction in consumption can solve the problem, while others like biodegradable plastic, ocean cleanup, using renewable energy in plastic industry can do little and in some cases may even worsen it. Another report referring to all the environmental and health effects of plastic says the same. Depletion of non-renewable minerals. Non-renewable mineral reserves are currently extracted at high and unsustainable rates from Earth's crust. Remaining reserves are likely to become ever more costly to extract in the near future and will reach depletion at some point. The era of relatively peaceful economic expansion that has prevailed globally since World War II may be interrupted by unexpected supply shocks or simply be succeeded by the peaking depletion paths of oil and other. In 2020, in the first time, the rate of use of natural resources arrived to more than 110 billion tons per year. Economist Jason Hickel has written critically about the ideology of green growth, the idea that as capitalism and systems expand, natural resources will also expand naturally, as it is compatible with our planet's ecology. This contradicts with the idea of no-growth economics or degrowth economics, where the sustainability and stability of the economy is prioritized over the uncontrolled profit of those in power. Models around creating development in communities have found that failing to account for sustainability in early stages leads to failure. These models contradict green growth theory and do not support ideas about expansion of natural resources. Additionally, those living in poor areas tend to be exposed to higher levels of toxins and pollutants as a result of systematic environmental racism. Increasing natural resources and increasing local involvement in their distribution are potential solutions to alleviate pollution and address poverty in these areas. Net depletion of renewable resources, use of renewable resources in excess of their replenishment rates, is undermining ecological stability worldwide. Between 2000 and 2012, deforestation resulted in some 14% of the equivalent of Earth's original forest cover to be cut down. Tropical rainforests have been subject to deforestation at a rapid pace for decades, especially in West and Central Africa and in Brazil, mostly due to subsistence farming, population pressure, and urbanization. Population pressures also strain the world's soil systems, leading to land degradation, mostly in developing countries. Global erosion rates on conventional cropland are estimated to exceed soil creation rates by more than 10 times. Widespread overuse of groundwater results in water deficits in many countries. By 2025, water scarcity could impact the living conditions of two-thirds of the world's population. Loss of biodiversity, the destructive impact of human activity on wildlife habitats worldwide. The natural nitrogen cycle is heavily overloaded by industrial nitrogen fixation and use, thereby disrupting most known types of ecosystems. The accumulating plastic debris in the oceans decimates aquatic life. Ocean acidification due to the excess concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is resulting in coral bleaching and impedes shell-bearing organisms. Arctic sea ice decline caused by global warming is endangering the polar bear. In 2019, a summary for policymakers of the largest, most comprehensive study to date of biodiversity and ecosystem services was published by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The report was finalized in Paris. The main conclusions: over the last 50 years, the state of nature has deteriorated at an unprecedented and accelerating rate. The main drivers of this deterioration have been changes in land and sea use, exploitation of living beings, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. These 5 drivers, in turn, are caused by societal behaviors, from consumption to governance. Damage to ecosystems undermines 35 of 44 selected UN targets, including the UN General Assembly's Sustainable Development Goals for poverty, hunger, health, water, cities, climate, oceans, and land. It can cause problems with food, water, and humanity's air supply. To fix the problem, humanity will need a transformative change, including sustainable agriculture, reductions in consumption and waste, fishing quotas, and collaborative water management. On page 8 of the summary, the authors state that one of the main measures is enabling visions of a good quality of life that do not entail ever-increasing material consumption. These mounting concerns have prompted an increasing number of academics and other writers beside Herman Daly to point to limits to economic growth and to question and even oppose the prevailing ideology of infinite. In September 2019, one day before the global climate strike on 20 September 2019, in The Guardian was published an article that summarizes many research and say that limiting consumption is necessary for saving the biosphere. Steady-state economy and well-being. Except the reasons linked to resource depletion and the carrying capacity of the ecological system, there are other reasons to limit consumption. Overconsumption hurts the well-being of those who consume too much. In the same time, when the ecological footprint of humanity exceeded the sustainable level, while GDP more than tripled from 1950, one of the well-being measures, genuine progress indicator, has fallen from 1978. This is one of the reasons for pursuing the steady-state economy. In some cases, reducing consumption can increase the life level. In Costa Rica, the GDP is 4 times smaller than in many countries in Western Europe and North America, but people live longer and better. An American study shows that when the income is higher than $75,000, an increase in profits does not increase well-being. For better measuring the well-being, the New Economics Foundations has launched the Happy Planet Index. The food industry is a large sector of consumption responsible for 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and studies show that people waste a fifth of food products just through disposal or overconsumption. By the time food reaches the consumer, 9%, 160 million tons goes uneaten, and 10% is lost to overconsumption, meaning consumers ate more than the calorie intake requirement. When the consumer takes in too much, this not only explains losses at the beginning of the stage at production and overproduction, but also lends itself to overconsumption of energy and protein, having harmful effects on the body like obesity. A report from the Lancet Commission says the same. The experts write, until now, undernutrition and obesity have been seen as polar opposites of either too few or too many calories. In reality, they are both driven by the same unhealthy, inequitable food systems, underpinned by the same political economy that is single-focused on economic growth and ignores the negative health and equity outcomes. Obesity was a medical problem for people who overconsumed food and worked too little already in ancient Rome, and its impact slowly grew through history. As to 2012, mortality from obesity was 3 times larger than from hunger, reaching 2.8 million people per year. By 2017, cycling reduces greenhouse gas emissions while reducing the effects of a sedentary lifestyle at the same time. As of 2002, sedentary lifestyle claimed 2 million lives per year. The World Health Organization stated that 60 to 85% of people in the world from both developed and developing countries lead sedentary lifestyles, making it one of the more serious yet insufficiently addressed public health problems of our time. By 2012, according to a study published in The Lancet, the number reached 5.3 million. Reducing the use of screens can help fight many diseases, among others depression, the leading cause of disability globally. It also can lower greenhouse gas emission. As of 2018, 3.7% of global emissions were from digital technologies. Connection with other ideologies, movements. The concept of steady-state economy is connected to other concepts that can be generally defined as ecological economics and anti-consumerism, because it serves as the final target of those concepts. Those ideologies are not calling for poverty but wants to reach a level of consumption that is the best for people and the environment. Degrowth. The concept of overdevelopment by Leopold Kohr. In 1977, Leopold Kohr published a book named The Overdeveloped Nations, The Diseconomies of Scale, talking primarily about overconsumption. This book is the basis for the theory of overdevelopment, saying that the global north, the rich countries, are too developed, which increases the ecological footprint of humanity and create many problems both in overdeveloped and underdeveloped countries. Conceptual and ideological disagreements. Several conceptual and ideological disagreements presently exist concerning the steady-state economy in particular and the dilemma of growth in general. The following issues are considered below: the role of technology, resource decoupling, and the rebound effect, a declining state economy, the possibility of having capitalism without growth, and the possibility of pushing some of the terrestrial limits into outer space. In 2019, a research presenting an overview of the attempts to achieve constant economic growth without environmental destruction and their results was published. It shows that by the year 2019, the attempts were not successful. It does not give a clear answer about future attempts. Herman Daly's approach to these issues are presented throughout the text. Role of technology. Technology is usually defined as the application of scientific method in the production of goods or in other social achievements. Historically, technology has mostly been developed and implemented in order to improve labor productivity and increase living standards. In economics, disagreement presently exists regarding the role of technology when considering its dependency on natural resources. In neoclassical economics, on the one hand, the role of technology is usually represented as yet another factor of production contributing to economic growth like land, labor, and capital contribute. However, in neoclassical production functions, where the output of produced goods are related to the inputs provided by the factors of production, no mention is made of the contribution of natural resources to the production process. Hence, technology is reified as a separate, self-contained device capable of contributing to production without receiving any natural resource inputs beforehand. This representation of technology also prevails in standard mainstream economics textbooks on the subject. In ecological economics, on the other hand, technology is represented as the way natural resources are transformed in the production process. Hence, Herman Daly argues that the role of technology in the economy cannot be properly conceptualized without taking into account the flow of natural resources necessary to support the technology itself. An internal combustion engine runs on fuels, machinery, and electric devices run on electricity. All capital equipment is made out of material resources to begin. In physical terms, any technology useful though it is works largely as a medium for transforming valuable natural resources into material goods that eventually end up as valueless waste and pollution, thereby increasing the entropy or disorder of the world as a whole. This view of the role of technology in the economy has been termed entropy pessimism. From the ecological point of view, it has been suggested that the disagreement boils down to a matter of teaching some elementary physics to the uninitiated neoclassical economists and other technological optimists. From the neoclassical point of view, leading growth theorist and Nobel Prize laureate Robert Solow has defended his much criticized position by replying in 1997 that elementary physics has not by itself prevented growth in the industrialized. Resource decoupling and the rebound effect. Resource decoupling occurs when economic activity becomes less intensive ecologically. A declining input of natural resources is needed to produce 1 unit of output on average, measured by the ratio of total natural resource consumption to gross domestic product (GDP). Relative resource decoupling occurs when natural resource consumption declines on a ceteris paribus assumption that is all other things being equal. Absolute resource decoupling occurs when natural resource consumption declines, even while GDP is growing. In the history of economic thought, William Stanley Javance was the first economist of some standing to analyze the occurrence of resource decoupling, although he did not use this term. In his 1865 book on the coal question, Javance argued that an increase in energy efficiency would by itself lead to more, not less, consumption of energy due to the income effect of the lowered energy expenditures. People would be rendered better off and demand even more energy, thereby outweighing the initial gain in efficiency. This mechanism is known today as the Javance Paradox or the rebound effect. Javance's analysis of this seeming paradox formed part of his general concern that Britain's industrial supremacy in the 19th century would soon be set back by the inevitable exhaustion of the country's coal mines, whereupon the geopolitical balance of power would tip in favor of countries abroad possessing more abundant mines. In 2009, 2 separate studies were published that, among other things, addressed the issues of resource decoupling and the rebound effect. German scientist and politician Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker published Factor 5, Transforming the Global Economy Through 80% Improvements in Resource Productivity, co-authored with a team of researchers from the natural. British ecological economist Tim Jackson published Prosperity Without Growth, drawing extensively from an earlier report authored by him for the UK Sustainable Development Commission. Consider each in turn. Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker argues that a new economic wave of innovation and investment based on increasing resource productivity, renewable energy, industrial ecology, and other green technology will soon kick off a green Contractive cycle, named after the Russian economist Nikolai Contractive. This new long-term cycle is expected to bring about as much as an 80% increase in resource productivity, or what amounts to a factor 5 improvement of the gross input per output ratio in the economy, and reduce environmental impact accordingly, von Weizsäcker promises. Regarding the adverse rebound effect, von Weizsäcker notes that efforts to improve efficiency have been fraught with increasing overall levels of consumption. As remedies, von Weizsäcker recommends three separate approaches: recycling of and imposing restrictions on the use of materials, establishing capital funds from natural resource proceeds for reinvestments in order to compensate for the future bust caused by depletion, and finally, taxing resource consumption so as to balance it with the available supplies. Tim Jackson points out that according to empirical evidence, the world economy has indeed experienced some relative resource decoupling. In the period from 1970 to 2009, the energy intensity, that is, the energy content embodied in world GDP, decreased by 33%, but as the world economy also kept growing, hence, no absolute energy resource decoupling materialized. Regarding key metal resources, the development was even worse in that not even relative resource decoupling had materialized in the period from 1990 to 2007. The extraction of iron ore, bauxite, copper, and nickel was rising faster than world GDP, to the effect that resource efficiency is going in the wrong direction, mostly due to emerging economies, notably. Jackson concludes his survey by noting that the dilemma of growth is evident when any resource efficiency squeezed out of the economy will sooner or later be pushed back up again by a growing GDP. Jackson further cautions that simplistic assumptions that capitalism's propensity for efficiency will stabilize the climate and solve the problem of resource scarcity are almost literally bankrupt. Herman Daly has argued that the best way to increase natural resource efficiency, decouple, and to prevent the occurrence of any rebound effects is to impose quantitative restrictions on. Daly believes this system features a unique triple advantage. Absolute and permanent limits are set on the extraction rate of use of and pollution, with the resources flowing through the economy, as opposed to taxes that merely alter the prevailing price structure without stopping growth, and as opposed to pollution standards and control, which are both costly and difficult to enact and enforce. More efficiency and recycling efforts are induced by the higher resource prices resulting from the restrictions, quota prices plus regular extraction costs. No rebound effects are able to appear, as any temporary excess demand will result only in inflation or shortages, or both, and not in increased supply, which is to remain constant and limited on a permanent basis. For all its merits, Daly himself points to the existence of physical, technological, and practical limitations to how much efficiency and recycling can be achieved by this proposed system. The idea of absolute decoupling, ridding the economy as a whole of any dependence on natural resources, is ridiculed polemically by Daly as angelizing GDP. It would work only if we ascended to become angels ourselves. Declining state economy. Capitalism without growth. Several radical critics of capitalism have questioned the possibility of ever imposing a steady state or a declining state degrowth system as a superstructure on top of capitalism. Taken together, these critics point to the following growth dynamics inherent in capitalism. Economic activity is generally guided by the profit motive, a competitive work ethos, and the drive to accumulate capital and wealth for its own sake, to gratify personal ambition, provide social prestige, or simply to get rich in a hurry. Psychologically, these drives in the work sphere repress and distort biological and social homeostases in most people. Employments and incomes depend directly on sales revenues, that is, on people spending money on the consumption of goods and services for sale on the market. This dependency creates a pecuniary incentive to increase sales as much as possible. To this end, much cunning advertising is devised to manipulate human wants and prop up consumption patterns, often resulting in lavish and wasteful consumerism. The financial system is based on fractional reserve banking, enabling commercial banks to hold reserves in amounts that are less than their deposit liabilities. This credit creation is multiplying the monetary base supplied by the central bank in order to assist private corporations expanding their activities. Technological development exhibits a strong labor-saving bias, creating the need to provide new employment elsewhere in the economy for workers displaced by the introduction of new technology. Private corporations generally resist government regulations and restrictions that impede profits and deter investment opportunities. Attempts to downscale the economy would rapidly degenerate into economic crisis and political instability on this count alone. Governments need tax revenues to service their debt obligations, run their institutions, and finance their welfare programs for the benefit of the public. Tax revenues are collected from general economic activity. In the capitalist world economy, globalization intensifies competition everywhere, both within and between countries. National governments are compelled to compete and struggle with each other to provide employment, investments, tax revenues, and wealth for their own populations. In short, there is no end to the systemic and ecologically harmful growth dynamics in modern capitalism, radical critics assert. Fully aware of the massive growth dynamics of capitalism, Herman Daly, on his part, poses the rhetorical question whether his concept of a steady-state economy is essentially capitalistic or socialistic. He provides the following answer, written in 1980. The growth versus steady-state debate really cuts across the old left-right rift, and we should resist any attempt to identify either growth or steady state with either left or right for two reasons. First, it will impose a logical distortion on the issue. Second, it will obscure the emergence of a third way, which might form a future synthesis of socialism and capitalism into a steady-state economy and eventually into a fully just and sustainable society. Daly concludes by inviting almost people, both liberal supporters of and radical critics of capitalism, pushing some of the terrestrial limits into outer space. Ever since the beginning of the modern space age in the 1950s, some space advocates have pushed for space habitation, frequently in the form of colonization, some arguing as a reason for alleviating human overpopulation, overconsumption, and mitigate the human impact on the environment on Earth, if not for other reasons. In the 1970s, physicist and space activist Gerard K. O'Neill developed a large plan to build human settlements in outer space to solve the problems of overpopulation and limits to growth on Earth without recourse to political repression. According to O'Neill's vision, mankind could and indeed should expand on this man-made frontier to many times the current world population and generate large amounts of new wealth in space. Herman Daly countered O'Neill's vision by arguing that a space colony would become subject to much harsher limits to growth and hence would have to be secured and managed with much more care and discipline than a steady-state economy on large and resilient Earth. Although the number of individual colonies supposedly could be increased without end, living conditions in any one particular colony would become very restricted nonetheless. Therefore, Daly concluded, the alleged impossibility of a steady state on Earth provides a poor intellectual launching pad for space colonies. By the 2010s, O'Neill's old vision of space colonization had long since been turned upside down in many places. Instead of dispatching colonists from Earth to live in remote space settlements, this new vision has the same double advantage of partly mitigating ecological pressures on Earth's limited mineral reserves while also boosting exploration and colonization of space. The building up of industrial infrastructure in space would be required for the purpose, as well as the establishment of a complete supply chain up to the level of self-sufficiency and then beyond, eventually developing into a permanent extraterrestrial source of wealth to provide an adequate return on investment for stakeholders. In the future, such an exo-economy, off-planet economy, could possibly even serve as the first step towards mankind's cosmic ascension to a type Roman II civilization on the hypothetical Kardashev scale, in case such an ascension will ever be accomplished. However, it is yet uncertain whether an off-planet economy of the type specified will develop in due time to match both the volume and the output mix needed to fully replace Earth's dwindling mineral reserves. Skeptics like Herman Daly and others point to exorbitant Earth-to-orbit launch costs of any space mission, inaccurate identification of target asteroids suitable for mining, and remote in situ or extraction difficulties as obvious barriers to success. Investing a lot of terrestrial resources in order to recover only a few resources from space in return is not worthwhile. In addition, even if an off-planet economy could somehow be established at some future point, one long-term predicament would then loom large regarding the continuous mining and transportation of massive volumes of materials from space back to Earth. In the worst of cases, all of these obstacles could forever prevent any substantial pushing of limits into outer space, and then limits to growth on Earth will remain the only limits of concern throughout mankind's entire span of existence. Implementation. Today, steady-state economy is not implemented officially by any state, but there are some measures that limit growth and means a steady level of consumption of some products per capita. Phase out of lightweight plastic bags that reduce consumption of bags and limit the number of bags per capita. Reducing the consumption of energy is a very popular measure implemented by many, called generally energy efficiency and energy saving. A coalition named 3% Club for energy efficiency was formed with a target of increasing energy efficiency by 3% per year. According to the International Energy Agency, energy efficiency can deliver more than 40% of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions needed to reach the target of Paris Agreement. In the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit, a coalition was created named Action Towards Climate-Friendly Transport. Its main targets include city planning that will reduce the need for transport and shifting to a non-motorized transport system. Such measures reduce the consumption of fuel. A method with growing popularity is reduce, reuse, and recycle. For example, reuse clothes through the second-hand market and renting clothes. The second-hand market, worth $24 billion as of 2018, and is expected to achieve bigger profit than the fast fashion market in the next years. The H&M company tries to implement it. Some countries accepted measurements, alternatives to gross domestic product, to measure success. Bhutan measures success in gross national happiness. This measurement was implemented partly in other countries. Other popular measurements include Gross National Well-Being, Better Life Index, and Social Progress Index. See pages. As of 2014, the Happy Planet Index is used in 153 countries. The OECD Better Life Index in 36 countries, members of OECD. Ecuador and Bolivia included in their constitutions the ideology of Sumac Causse Buenvivir that incorporates ideas of degrowth, e.g., contains some principles of the steady-state economy.